Another 5 seconds.
It's hard to look at the camera when the people are on the side.
Exactly. I don't like it that way.
Why can't the camera be put over there? In the back.
Because the internet pieces are, the internet wire is over there. You can go ahead.
You should be eating an apple.
Good afternoon. Welcome to a weekly class on ethics of the fathers, Pirkei Avot. One of the hallmarks of Jewish life is arguing. And if you don't believe me, you could argue the point. Jews have always engaged in debate, arguments, and sometimes we look at them as being very divisive, and that's when we start emphasizing the importance of unity, and we should stop arguing and bickering. But sometimes we look at the differences of opinion as being part of a healthy way of living. And not only is it healthy, but one could argue that Judaism, Jewish life, thrived because of the lively discussions and arguments and debates that we've engaged in for thousands of years. You don't have to, you just go right back to the Torah, to the Bible, and you see differences of opinion. There's even a debate in the Torah itself between Moses and his brother, a legal debate. And in the end, Moses agrees that he was wrong and they were right. Unusual thing to find the leader admitting that he's wrong. But you find this disagreement between Moses and his brother, and there are many other disagreements in the Torah, and especially in the Talmud. The Talmud has thousands of disagreements where people are arguing and debating points of Jewish law, Jewish theology. So this mission over here establishes the ground rules for debate and arguments. There are two kinds of arguments. There's one that are referred to as dispute for the sake of heaven, and the one that is not for the sake of heaven. So let's go through this, and then we'll go into it with more depth.
Might be the shuls.
Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will, in the end, endure. If your dispute is the good kind, for the sake of heaven, which means that you're arguing because you're motivated by the pursuit of what does God want, not what I want, but what God wants of me, and my colleague has a different opinion as to what God wants of him or us. So if that dispute is for the sake of heaven, in the end it'll endure. I'll soon explain what that means. What does it mean it will endure? But if it's not for the sake of heaven, if you're arguing about your own interests, you have an opinion about what's best for you, what suits your feelings, and the other one has the same argument that suits his or her feelings, that dispute will not endure. Again, what does that mean, and not endure? We'll have to explain. And the Mishnah then gives two illustrations, an illustration of the former, of the one that's for the sake of heaven, and an illustration for the one that is not for the sake of heaven. Which is the controversy that is for the sake of heaven? What does that mean, which? Where do we find an example of this? Such was the controversy of Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were the two leaders of the Jewish people in about 100 years before the temple was destroyed. Hillel and Shammai would argue, but mostly their disciples would argue with one another. Hillel and Shammai both established academies of learning, and they would debate and engage in arguments about what what is the right path? What is the halacha? What is the law? And they would be engaged in very, very lively debate for years and years. That's a debate that was for the sake of heaven. This was not about my personal interest. It was not about my personal honor and glory. I don't have to insist that I'm always right and you're always wrong. It's about what is the truth? What does God want from us? And that was the sole motivator of their arguments. And that type of dispute will endure. Again, I'll soon explain what that means. And which is the controversy that is not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and all his congregation. Korach was Moses' cousin, first cousin. And Korach started a rebellion against Moses, claiming that Moses was an imposter, that he took the role of leader by himself. It wasn't God who told him to be the leader. He challenged Moses' choice of Aaron to be the high priest, and other arguments against Moses. And the end was that Korach refused to bend and to budge, and Korach and his entire entourage, his family and everyone that joined him, hundreds of people, were all swallowed up by the earth and obviously perished. So that dispute didn't endure. There are many questions here. For example, one question is, when it talks about the dispute between Hillel and Shammai, those were the two disputants, Hillel versus Shammai, Shammai versus Hillel. But when it talks about Korach, it doesn't say Korach and Moses, Korach versus Moses, Moses versus Korach. It's Korach and his congregation. Why doesn't it mention Moses was part of this? So we'll get to that a little bit later. So let's go back again. A machloket, a dispute that is for the sake of heaven, is the pursuit of truth. How do you know if something's for the sake of heaven? How do you know if someone is arguing and they really mean it because this is what God wants? Because they want the truth. And if they can see that the truth is not what they felt initially, they'll say, you know what, I was wrong. How many times do you see in the political arena Democrats and Republicans arguing with each other, and one of them says, you know what, you were right. I have yet to hear that from either side. Why? Because I don't even have the slightest suspicion that they mean it for the truth. They're not looking for truth. They may have good intentions also. They may think that their opinions are better for the society. I'm not saying that they're all criminals. Many of them are, but not all of them. But they're not looking for absolute truth. Because if you're looking for absolute truth, you're able to say, what I told you was wrong. I admit it. You were right, I was wrong. And we find in the Talmud, the greatest sages would argue, and sometimes they would hear the counter-argument of their fellow, and they would say, you're right. They would give in. They would not hesitate. If they felt that the other opinion was right, they were convinced, they would give in. I heard this from a rabbi who was a scholar, but compared to the Rebbe, he was like a 1 compared to 100. But he told me he was once arguing with the Rebbe, before the Rebbe became Rebbe, and they were arguing about a matter of Talmud, and after, I don't know if it was a few hours or a few days, the Rebbe came back to him and says, Yitzchak, that's what was his name, you were right. Now, I'm sure if the Rebbe wanted, he could have used his mental acuity, his brilliance, to twist things around in such a way that he would maintain his position that he was right, and even convince the other person that he was right. But the Rebbe was only interested in truth. And if the truth says that you're right and I'm wrong, then another example, I think I told this story once before, the greatest, perhaps the greatest Talmudist of the late 20th century, one of the greatest for sure, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, was one of the most brilliant scholars in the world. And when the Rebbe lost his mother, he came to comfort the Rebbe, and they engaged in a debate about a matter of Jewish law concerning mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. And at one point, the Rebbe said, Maimonides has this opinion. And Rabbi Soloveitchik said to the Rebbe, there is no such statement in Maimonides' writings. There is no such statement. And the Rebbe got up to get the volume, and the Rabbi Soloveitchik says, Rabbi, Lubavitcher Rebbe, don't trouble yourself to get up. You will not find it. There is no such Rambam. Rabbi Soloveitchik knew the Rambam cold. And so did the Rebbe. So the Rebbe sat down, didn't try to prove his point. And a few days later, the Rebbe wrote him a letter saying, the Rambam is in this volume, and this page. However, you were right, because in the later edition of the Rambam, the Yemenite edition, which had the Rambam's revisions, I mentioned this in the class Sunday, that the Rambam would always revise his writings and send them to Yemen. That's where he had his greatest following. And in that revised edition, Maimonides deleted that statement. So the Rebbe, instead of saying, I was right because I showed you the text, the Rebbe told him, you were right because we go by what in the end. In the end, Maimonides rejected that original view. And Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote, says, I saw that the I don't know the exact words, but the obsession with truth of the Rebbe. Here he could have easily said, I won the argument, because if he had gotten that volume at the time that they had the argument, he would have showed him that the Rambam says that. No, he was willing to concede the point to others. That's what then when you know the person is doing it l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, for the sake of God, not for the sake of your own ego and your own interests. What does it mean that in the end it'll endure? So there are a few explanations what that means. One explanation is that you will survive. If your argument is about truth and you're interested in the truth, the end will be that you will survive and thrive. But if your pursuit is only for your own ego, you're not interested in the sake of doing it for the sake of heaven, you will not endure. Literally, you will not endure. As we find Korach perished because of this dispute. Now, does it always mean that if you argue and you're not sincere about your argument, you're not looking for truth, you're not doing it for the sake of heaven, does that mean you're going to be swallowed up by the earth? No, but it means that you will lose in the end. You will lose prestige. You will lose your ability to succeed in other areas of life. You will be a loser in the end. So if you think you have to be a winner all the time because you're looking out for your own interest, the end will be you will be a loser. Korach could have been regarded as one of the elites of the Jewish people at that time. He was a very distinguished individual. But not only did he lose his elite role, he lost everything. So just because you feel you have to prove yourself right, because your ego is so big, the end is that you will lose. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that even though Hillel and Shammai argued, we still study the words of both of them. They're both held in high regard. Yes, whenever Hillel and Shammai, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, would argue, and hundreds of arguments, whose opinion do we follow? We follow the opinion of the school of Hillel. The Talmud tells a story that the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai were arguing, and they heard a heavenly voice. And the heavenly voice says, well, you should follow the school of Hillel. But it wasn't just the heavenly voice. The majority of the sages sided with the school of Hillel. So the Talmud then says, but even though we follow the school of Hillel, the school of Shammai is also expressing the words of God. Elu ve'elu, these and these are the words of the living God. Both the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai are telling us what is true and what is correct. So the question is, how could they both be right? The answer is, well, when two people argue, you can only about what should be your course of behavior, you can only follow one opinion. You can't do two opposites at the same time.
No, why not?
You can do two opposites, okay. I can't. Either you do this, you do X, or you do Y. You can't do X and Y. But that doesn't mean that because I'm going to do X, because that was the decision, the majority favored X, that doesn't mean that Y is wrong. Because they can both, from different vantage points, they can both be right. You could use the same logic in different ways. I'll give you an example, a biblical example. Why did God bring the flood to destroy the world, to destroy the earth? Because people were evil.
Yeah.
And the Torah describes because humans are evil from their youth. We start off being evil and we continue that way. So that God says, I can't have a world where there's so much evil. Now, after the flood is over, Noah comes out of the ark. He brings a sacrifice to God. And God says, I will no longer bring any flood to destroy the world because humans are evil from their youth. He uses the same argument. In other words, he's saying, because we're so evil, we should be destroyed. But because we're so evil, that's our nature. We can't help it. So why would God want to destroy us if he made us that way? So the Torah uses the same argument in opposite directions. When you talk about a subject, you can look at a subject from a vantage point of kindness and the vantage point of judgment. All of existence is a duality. It's a unity that pervades the duality, but in the world we have in what letter does the Torah begin? The Torah begins with the letter Bet, which is two, duality. God is one. The first of the 10 Commandments begins with the letter Aleph, because God is one. But the world is a duality, a plurality. The world is not unified in and of itself. And the two directions are generally right and left, the way the Kabbalists describe it. Right is chesed, kindness, giving, and left is gvura, judgment, withholding, and disciplining and judging. When you look at things from the perspective of chesed, your conclusion will be one way. When you look at things from the direction of gvura, of judgment, your conclusion will be a different way. If you're a person who by nature is compassionate and kind and loving, and someone did something wrong, you're going to see the good in them. If your nature, by definition, your nature is judgmental, rigid, judicial, you're going to see the negative. The school of Hillel were mostly chesed, were mostly kindness. That's why the school of Hillel were usually more permissive, more lenient. The school of Shammai was more judgmental. That's why they were usually more strict. But they both had elements of the other. Sometimes the school of Hillel also had judgment. Sometimes the school of Shammai also had kindness. It's interesting, in Ethics of the Fathers, in the first chapter, the school, Shammai, not the school of Shammai, Shammai himself, what was his favorite maxim? Greet every person with a cheerful countenance. Smile to everyone. This is the man who was judgmental and rigid and threw the potential convert out of his house because he demanded to be taught the whole Torah standing on one foot. He had no patience for this guy and he threw him out. It says he threw him out with a measuring rod. That's symbolic. He measured him, he judged him, and his judgment was obviously negative, and for a good reason. Chutzpah, someone comes to you and says, all of Judaism I could learn in 5 seconds, teach it all to me. So Shammai deliberately and correctly says, you're no candidate for conversion, and he threw him out. But Hillel, on the other hand, approached him from the vantage point of kindness, and he saw the positive in this man. That man was not a nice man, this potential convert. He was disrespectful, but he saw beneath the surface that there was some goodness in him and potential in him. Who was right, Shammai or Hillel? The answer is both. Depends which vantage point. Now, in the end, Hillel prevailed. But that doesn't mean that Shammai's approach was wrong. So when you have the dispute that's for the sake of heaven, in the end they're both right. They can both be right. They could also both be wrong. And it could be, one could be right, one could be wrong. But they could also both be right, even though we can only follow one. According to the great Kabbalist known as the Arizal, who lived 450 years ago, actually he passed away 451 years ago, because my son Yeshua was born on his yard site the day he passed away, 400 years later to the day. So I know I've calculated my son's age, and I know figure out how many years ago the Arizal lived. He passed away 451 years ago. And he writes that although the Talmud makes it clear that whenever the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai argue, we follow the school of Hillel. But in the Messianic age, we'll be following the school of Shammai. That means that the school of Shammai's logic is not rejected. It's just not implemented because he can only follow one opinion. But ultimately, we will be following the school of Shammai. So what practical application does it have? I can give you one very easily. On Hanukkah, we have the famous dispute. According to the school of Hillel, you light one candle the first night, you add one more to the second night, and the third night, up to the eighth. The school of Shammai say you start with 8, and you go in descending order. The second night 7, the third night 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What's the logic behind their argument? There are many different explanations, but one explanation is that Hillel says we can't focus that much on fighting evil. We have to fight evil, of course, but the focus should be on bringing light into the world. So we start off with a little bit of light. Even a little light could dispel a lot of darkness, but you can't be content with a little light. The next night you add more. Whenever it comes to matters of light, you always increase, you always add on, always do more. Never be complacent or content with the little good that you do. Always try to do more and improve on that. But then there's another approach. Let's get rid of all the evil. If you get rid of all the evil, we'll have a much better world. So when you get rid of evil, you start off with a lot of evil, and then you get rid of it, some of it, the next step, the next night, there's less evil. So you don't need as much light. So the focus, according to the school of Shammai, is on getting rid of the evil, because he's the man of judgment. Judgment is there to ensure the law is practiced and the evil does not control everything. So we start off with 8, and then we don't need as much. The next night we do 7, then we go down until 1. Right now we have to follow the school of Hillel, because we don't have the power to combat evil in the way that the school of Shammai maintained. We should focus more on adding more and more light, starting off with a little bit and always increasing. You know, I mentioned this in another class recently, but we have a dispute we have 2 sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, and Jacob was blessing them. And Joseph wanted his father to put his right hand on the head of his older son, Manasseh, and the left hand on the younger son, because in Jewish tradition, we give precedence to the firstborn over the children who come later. When a person passes away, the Torah says the firstborn inherits a double portion. So Joseph put his 2 sons, one to the right of Jacob and one to the left. The older son to his right, and the younger son to his left. And what did Jacob do? Jacob, who couldn't see well, crossed his arms and put his right hand on the head of the younger son and the left hand on the head of the older son. And Joseph protested, no, you're getting it wrong. This is the older son. And Jacob says, I know, he'll be great, but the younger one will be greater. What was going on? What was this debate going on? So Hasidic commentators explain that Manasseh, the word Manasseh, that was the name of the older son, comes from the word to forget. Joseph said, I have forgotten the misery of my childhood now that I'm here in Egypt. He was focusing on his misery and trying to get rid of his anguish and his pain. That's what That's what his older son represented, getting rid of the negative. The younger son, Ephraim, was so named because it comes from a root that means to multiply, to be fruitful, to grow. His second son was no longer pained by his past. He got over it. And now he's focusing on thriving, on reproducing, not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally, adding more light to his life. So which comes first? Getting rid of negativity or doing good? And the answer is you usually have to get rid of negativity. And if you rent a house and the place is filthy, you're not going to move in and live there until you get someone to clean it. After you clean it, then you move in. So you get rid of the negative and then you do the positive. But which is more important? Which takes precedence? Getting rid of the dirt doesn't give you a place to live. You want a place in which you can thrive. So Menashe comes first, but Ephraim is superior. That's the difference between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. The school of Hillel is more important now because it's about adding light. But when the Mashiach comes in the Messianic age, we will be able to get rid of all of evil. And then the focus will be getting rid of the evil. The Rabbi, in one of his discourses, and it's a long discussion, a very deep one, says that, and ultimately, in the final stages of the Messianic age, we will do two opposites. Right now, we can't do two opposites. We'll do both Hillel and Shammai. So their dispute will endure. But they endure in another way, as I just said before. We still study. When we study Talmud, we study the school of Shammai's teachings no less than the school of Hillel. So when it comes to practice, we do one, but we study and we live and we thrive on both of them. Another thing about, for the sake of heaven, the Hebrew word for heaven is shamayim. Shamayim. Where does the word shamayim come from? So Rashi tells us shamayim is two words, eish mayim. You say eish fast, eish mayim, shamayim. Fire and water. What are the two symbols of right and left, or chesed, kindness and judgment? Eish is judgment, burns, it destroys. Mayim nurtures. That's chesed, that's kindness. So when you study Torah, when you argue, and you argue in a way that synthesizes shamayim, that synthesizes fire and water, that's a positive dispute. That means if you're just one-sided, all you are is eish, you're just fire. That's all you care about, is judging people, fighting evil, destroying evil, which is not negative, but that's all you are. And the other person is, I'm just about chesed, I'm just about being kind and tolerating everything and allowing people getting away with murder, literally and figuratively. If all you are is mayim, is water, is kindness, that's not going to endure. That's not the way a human being has to behave. A human being has to synthesize the two. That's why the school of Hillel occasionally would agree with the school of Shammai and be lenient. And the school of Shammai would be strict. And occasionally the school of Shammai would agree to the school of Hillel to be lenient. Because a complete human being is one who is not one monochrome, just one color, just one approach. You have to have balance in life. That's the beauty of Torah. Torah has the gematria, the numerical value of two Hebrew words, ratzo v'shuv. Ratzo means advancing, running away, escaping the evil of the world, and shuv means retreating, engaging the world, and doing good in this world and contributing to the world. Torah is the ultimate balance between fire and water. Torah allows you to synthesize the two. Sometimes you accentuate the fire aspect, sometimes you accentuate the water aspect. But you need both. You can't just have one. If you have only one, you'll burn up. If you have the other one, you'll drown. You must have both. I mentioned this, yes?
I was wondering, the word for heaven is neshama? Shammai?
Shamayim is heaven.
Is there a correlation with soul, neshama, and Shem name in the root?
No. Maybe there's some very remote connection, but there's no obvious connection. So, if you have only one, that'll be your demise. It won't endure. And where is there an example of that? Korach and his cohorts. What happened to them? So the Torah tells us two things happened. Some of them were swallowed up, they went down, and some of them were burnt in fire. They went up in smoke. What was wrong with Korach and his cohorts is that they were not multidimensional. They had no balance. They were either there were those who wanted to go up and they were fiery, full of passion. They had nothing to balance their passion. They burnt up in the end. Then there were those who were into the water dynamic of water is something that flows downward, engaging the world, not escaping the world, but they wanted to engage the world too much. They were too much involved in the materialistic aspects of life. So the ones who were swallowed up in the earth, because they were prisoners of the earth. The others who were into their fiery nature, they wanted to be higher than, holier than everyone, they burnt up because they had nothing to quench their thirst. They had nothing to mollify their passion. So that's why it says over here, this was the dispute between Korach and his congregation, because they were not all identical. Some of them were more into the earth, some were more into the fire, more into the water, more into the fire. So it was between Korach and his own congregation. They didn't have the balance. And when you don't have balance, you will not endure. A simpler way of explaining why he mentions Korach and his congregation and not Korach and Moses, because Moses was not part of a fight. Moses didn't pick a fight. Moses didn't say, Korach, I don't like you, I want you out. Korach was the one who was fighting, Korach and his congregation, not Moses. If we would have, when Hillel and Shammai argue, yes, Hillel would argue against Shammai, and Shammai would argue against Hillel. But when Korach was arguing, he was arguing with his own people. They were coming at Moses from different directions. Yes, they were unified, but unified in the wrong way. And this is something that's very practical today. When you see people joining forces together, like we see at the demonstrations against Israel, the pro-Hamas demonstrations, you have elements that are Arab, militants, terrorist sympathizers. You have people who are into Black Lives Matter. You have people who are into every other cause today, gay rights and whatever else. I'm not going to list every cause, but they're all coalescing, and they call it intersectionality. They're bringing all these supposed aggrieved people into one camp. Are they united? It sounds like that. They're united. They're the most disunited people because they're going to be killing each other. If, God forbid, they ever succeed in doing what they want to do against Israel, they will be at each other's throats and killing each other. They'll be murdering one another, which is what they do today. When you talk about unity, there are two kinds of unity. There's unity that's organic, that's inherent. You come from the same background, you have the same destiny, you have the same soul, and there's unity for a purpose. And this is found in the Torah, actually. When the Jewish people came to Mount Sinai, the Torah says that they were like one person with one heart. They were totally united. Never before and never after have Jews been as united as they were at Mount Sinai. They were ki'ish echad, like one person, belev echad, with one heart, with one desire. Later on, when the Egyptians are pursuing the Jews to the Red Sea, it uses the singular expression, and again our sages tell us that they were all united, belev echad, with one heart, Ki'ish echad, like one person. The reverse order. When it comes to the Jews being united, it says they were like one person with one heart. When it comes to the Egyptians united, with one heart, like one person. What's the difference? So Hasidic commentators explain that when the Jews were united, their unity was intrinsic, was inherent. They were like one person. They had one soul. They felt their one soul. They felt that every Jew shares one soul with every other Jew. And that manifested itself that they had one heart, one desire. When the Egyptians were pursuing the Jews, their unity was a very different kind of unity. It was the opposite. They had one desire. Let's get those Jews. That's what we're hearing in Columbia. We're hearing that in Harvard. We're hearing that in Hamas in Gaza. Get those Jews. And then they coalesce into one person. But they're not really one. They're not really united. They're as disparate and as disunited as one can possibly be. And they're eventually going to be killing each other if they haven't already started. Because it's not based on love. It's not based on a common soul, a common destiny. It's based on a common selfish interest, perverted selfish interest. So that's the difference between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. Their divisions were not real divisions because they were like one person. And that's why, even though they were very forceful in their debates, the Talmud says they never stopped marrying into each other's families, eating each other's food. They got along. Why? Because it was a debate based on the pursuit of truth. It wasn't based on any type of enmity, any type of hatred. They had true unity. Sometimes we have different opinions, but the underlying all those different opinions is one soul that unites us all. Any questions?
Is there a relationship between Korach and the spies, or no?
Yes, there is a relationship. The Torah tells the story of Korach right after the story with the spies. And the Rabbi explained in one of his talks that the connection between the two is the spies didn't want to go into Israel because they liked the spiritual life they enjoyed in the desert. But they had no worries, no wars, no need to work for a living, to produce food. They could devote themselves entirely to spiritual matters. Well, when that proved to be wrong, Korach took it to the other extreme. He says, spirituality doesn't mean anything. It's just physically engaging in the actions of following the mitzvot, the commandments. He says, in that case, why is Moses any better than me? He's more spiritual? Who cares about spirituality? You just told me the spirituality doesn't matter. Again, he lost the balance. There's a balance. Yes, you need spirituality alone. You could live your life in a cave and never harm another human being and never do anything other than think about God all the time, and you're a failure because you didn't bring God into this physical world. Or a person who says, I'm going to become a materialist because God wants the physical world, and you forget about spirituality, you're just going to be swallowed up by the earth. So that's what that is exactly the point, that there was no balance between kindness and judgment, between advancing and retreating, between fire and water. There has to be that balance.
There were other rabbis in the Gemara other than Hillel and Shammai.
But those are used as the prototypical case of a dispute, because the Talmud says about their dispute that they are both the words of God. Even though we follow only the school of Hillel, both represent God's words. So that's a dispute that it's like the model for all future disputes. Do you want to argue the point?
So Rabbi Meir would fall under one of them?
Rabbi Meir was later. Rabbi Meir was a disciple of Rabbi Akiva, who was a disciple of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, who were disciples of Hillel. Actually, disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who were disciples of Hillel.
Okay.
So this is like a few generations later.
Okay.
Could I ask a clarification of the name? Is it the Ariel or the Aryeh? That you mentioned lived several hundred years ago.
Arizal.
Arizal.
Ari is an acronym. Adonenu, our master, Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Isaac, and Zal stands for Zechrono Levrach. His name should be his memory should be for a blessing.
Okay.
So he's often referred to by putting those two acronyms together. Arizal.
The Arizal. There was also the Aryeh? No.
Aryeh.
Yeah. What is the Hebrew word for lion?
Aryeh. Ari or Aryeh. So his students were called the lion cubs, because he was referred to as Ari, a lion, which is the acronym of his title and his name. So they called his students the lion cubs.
Okay, that's nice.
It's not a name of a football team. Okay.
I have a question. How about you?
Yes.
Nice seeing you.
It says here, every dispute that's for the sake of heaven will in the end endure.
Yeah.
What does that mean? The disputes can endure? Or their positions will endure? I don't want arguments to endure, I want them to be solved.
Okay. There is a somewhat humorous interpretation of that. And when people argue, and they argue, it's not about me, it's about God, it's about the Torah, those arguments will never be solved. Because as long as the person convinces himself wrongly that all he cares about is God, that's a dispute that will never be solved, because because how could I compromise in God? That's what you
Resolve this or not going to resolve?
No, so I'm just saying that's
The
it.
argument shouldn't endure. Their position should
Well,
endure.
the positions do endure. We still study the teachings of Hillel and Shammai, no less than they were in the days of Hillel and Shammai. So both of their opinions do endure. And though we follow the school of Hillel, we will eventually follow the school of Shammai.